Welcome back, everybody, to Between Two Sermons. Great to be back with you after a week hiatus, and welcome to the fall edition of Between Two Sermons.
It's still sunny out, but it's colder.
Oh, yeah. So we, and another question that Rob and I get quite often from people within the church is, when you're on Between Two Sermons, do you coordinate your outfits?
Yes.
And the answer is always yes.
Of course.
We call each other every
Text
morning.
in the morning.
Yes,
absolutely.
yeah.
Not just on Wednesdays. Especially on Wednesdays.
Especially Wednesdays.
Thursdays.
Yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So great to have you all back with us. And thanks, Rob, for leading us through this sermon on Daniel 4. And we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar. And
for the last time?
The last time we talk about Nebuchadnezzar. And this dream is a funky dream. Yeah. This is a weird section. Daniel has some of these weird things in there. Yeah. And you kind of like, is he like on some mind-altering things right now? Yeah. And Nebuchadnezzar's having this dream and this vision. And Daniel really isn't a part of this even conversation. Nebuchadnezzar is just kind of going through his experience with God. He's sharing his experience with God, and he wants the world to know his experience with God.
Yeah. Well, there's two things interesting about this chapter, those of us who've been reading it. One is kind of what you said, which it's much less conflictual between Daniel and these other wise men. It's kind of a no-brainer. Daniel comes in. There's no one. The king doesn't ask to be told his dream, which happened once before in this book. That sort of was very challenging. He just gives it straight out. And in a way, even reading it, I don't want to say it's self-explanatory, but it's not as mysterious in some ways.
Right.
Because especially if you've heard the other dreams, it sort of seems like it's talking about him. So that's one thing. But the other thing that's really interesting is in this chapter, and I think I mentioned it, is it's reversed. He starts with the end in mind. The first couple of verses, he basically tells you the end of the story. I had a dream. God did amazing things. All is well. Now let's back up.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Maybe because it's the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life. But the other quick thing I would say, I didn't mention this all in the sermon, but it's an interesting topic that you made me think of it, is dreams and visions. And some things that I've read have said, because some people even today, I had a dream. I mean, we hear this a lot. And I don't, God can do whatever he wants to do. But one writer I was reading said, what you see in Daniel and Ezekiel in particular, maybe even in the book of Revelation, often these things happen sometimes. I think in Nebuchadnezzar, something about I was on my bed or something. But at least this writer said these are visions even more than they are dreams. And that's why there's such clarity and they mean something. So maybe, I don't know if that makes a difference to some, but sometimes I think, because I have this happen to me, not all the time, but often where someone will tell me they had a dream and they're trying to tell me something and it's like, okay, maybe.
Right.
But I think God uses, let's say this, even like Peter's famous story in Acts, he went up and he was in a trance, I think is what the King James says. So anyway, it's a side conversation, but.
No, that's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting point. It's not just a dream in the typical way that we think about dreams.
Right.
It's actually this altered state.
Yeah, it's a revelation of a kind.
A revelation. God specifically giving him
something,
a revelation directly to him.
Right.
And your first point, I think, is one that maybe sometimes we hear a lot in church.
Yes.
In church circles, we talk like this. Maybe it sounds a little bit trite sometimes.
Yes.
But nonetheless, it's true.
Yeah.
And God has a plan for your life.
Yeah. Or and I thought it was so interesting, in those opening verses. And, it's this, I think it's meant to be seen as this sort of written declaration he sends out to his kingdom, all people, all languages. So he's saying, that's talking about a room full of people.
Yeah.
It's clearly a written document that is supposed to be curried around the kingdom. And it says, I want you to know that God has done something amazing for me. For me.
Yes.
So he's not saying, he may say this later in the book, Daniel's God's a great God and you should listen to what he says, or he's bigger than the other gods. But it really is what we would call today a personal testimony.
Yes.
So I think, it just made me wonder and think, and only Daniel knows and the Holy Spirit knows the ultimate purposes of this chapter of this part of the Bible. But it seems to be saying, Nebuchadnezzar is as important as he was, as favored as he was, as silver spoon kid as he was, he thought he had this moment that God had a purpose for my life. And that's kind of the impression I get from reading it. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, and he wants other people. It seems if you're reading his whole narrative here, he wants other people to embrace the fact that God is the author of their story as well.
That's right.
He is a God who causes people to rise and causes kingdoms to fall. And it's so interesting as you read along Daniel, and this dream is part of that, or this vision is a part of that, how many times the word like rule is used in the word in the whole book of Daniel.
Yeah, but this chapter in particular.
Yeah. Rule or kingdoms.
Yeah.
Like it's really thick in this chapter.
Yes.
He rules, his kingdom, and he causes kings to rise. He causes kingdoms to fall. So, and in the midst of that, he cares about the individual and too. So he sends out this message to everybody in the kingdom, so that they can know what he's experienced.
Yeah, and I think too, maybe as we think about the context of living in Babylon, and we make that analogous to living in the world today, I think that's legitimate. And for people to say then and now, God, where are you? Yeah. And how come things aren't working out so well in this part of life or this part of the world? And I think part of the message is God wants, in a sort of theological way, to say, even, you might say, I'm adding this, and even though the world seems upside down, God rules.
Yes.
And I think that's important to know.
Yeah.
And a lot of the book of Daniel, this chapter 2, right? This whole tree, and it seems to be that, God's saying, I'm bigger than the kingdoms of this world. Mm-hmm. I'm ultimately the ultimate decider. And he even used the word verdict, I think, in the chapter somewhere. So that's helpful too. I think that's part of the point, not just in Daniel 4, but in other chapters in this book, that he wants let's call it the exiled people of God, which includes us in a sense. We live in a world that maybe it's a little brighter than Babylon in the 500 years before Jesus. I don't know. I don't live then in the sense of freedoms of speech or whatever, but we don't live in a world that is, the Garden of Eden. So I think the point is God is ultimately the ruler of the world. That can itself be a helpful truth to walk around with.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter what that kingdom is, like we were talking about before this too. There were other kingdoms that were around during that time of Babylon as well.
Right, that's right.
That from a biblical perspective, they knew what they knew in their sphere. They didn't know about the Aztecs
or
then
people
the
probably didn't even know.
And,
probably never left their hometown.
Right.
I mean, the vast majority of people. Some did, but
totally. Yeah. I mean, probably didn't go beyond a 30-mile radius in their entire life.
Right.
And yet the king, so no matter what kingdom you're a part of, God is saying, hey, I am the king above it all. I'm the king above it all.
And it's important for, even in the history of Israel, we talked about this earlier in this study, the idea of exile, the people of God, to the degree that they're analogous, we learn something. Paul says that the Jewish history is written for as an example to us, right? It's still the same God that we have in the New Testament. But they lived most of their history in not in what we call the Promised Land. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty significant point.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean God doesn't love you any less. He doesn't have a plan for your life, right? Joseph had a plan. Daniel seemed to have a very meaningful life. Even in this chapter is pretty meaningful, but he didn't live in his hometown or in his comfortable country where people believed what he believed.
Yeah. And your second point, following up on that, yes, God has a plan for our lives, but if we're not careful, pride can get in the way.
Yeah, it's huge.
I think that's a really good warning for all of us and something for us to take into consideration.
And, even the last verse, I think I read it, not every chapter is so, clean and, organized, point 1, point 2, point 3, and, opener and then a closer. But this one kind of has that feel.
Yeah.
And Nebuchadnezzar opens with his own, brief testimony, first 3 or 4 verses. But then at the end, that final verse, I'm paraphrasing, but it says, God has the power and he has the ability to humble people who are prideful or something. I'm paraphrasing. That seems to be, even though pride's not the only sin in the Bible, but some would say, you know, when going back to Genesis and other places, it's the sort of the sin below all sins. And maybe the thing that traps us and trips us up in our lives, perhaps more than any other, or is related directly or indirectly to many of our troubles, is our pride. So that's an important thing. And we see that, you know, really pulled out in this chapter. It's really a chapter in many ways. If Nebuchadnezzar is the protagonist and Daniel is the sort of antagonist with a, you know, in a good way, he's God's prophet. It's about pride, and his pride is being challenged. And you see both the detriment to pride, the dangers of pride, and the potential benefits of humility and surrender.
Yeah, which in a sense, I mean, if you think about it, is maybe one of the meta narratives of the whole Bible.
No question.
You know, the idea of humility and pride, like pride will always bring us down, and we see it over and over and over again. You know, Proverbs, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall.
Right.
In you know, Jesus, what does Jesus call out the most? I mean, he's calling out pride.
Right.
Over
even the
over
opening chapters of the Bible, you know, the fall of man, so to speak, and the Tower of Babel. Just those two very shorthand stories, first 11 chapters of the Bible, which are, you know, the first book of the Bible, is all about human pride.
Right.
And how human pride has, you know, it's been a source of self-defeat for humanity.
Well, I guess it's that pride actually works in opposition to faith, if you think about it that way.
It's well said.
Because you can't be reliant on God if you're proud in yourself.
That's right.
It's impossible.
That's right.
Because you're trusting in yourself if you're proud.
Right.
Versus being reliant on God.
No, that's well said.
And I do like the fact that this story ends with this kind of miraculous Nebuchadnezzar. His mind returns to him and he sees clearly, and he has this moment of like, wow, this God of the universe, this King of all kings, really is the one that's deserving of worship. And do we know, like, is he actually in this moment becoming a follower of the God of the Bible?
Yeah.
I don't know. It could be.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
Certainly he's come farther than in earlier chapters, where he seems to be. Even in this chapter, we didn't read the whole thing, but Daniel interprets his dream, and it says, for 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar just kind of went on his way. And one day, literally mentions 12 months later, he has walking and has this sort of moment of self-reflection, which is prideful. And then, you know, everything falls apart. It would seem that even after all that's happened in these earlier chapters of, you know, let's call it God's favor and answers, he still is not getting it. But it seems like, to your point, and maybe that's certainly one of the suggested implications at the end, both the beginning of the chapter and the end, he seems to be a different person, has come to a different conclusion than just, you know, this is put your money on this horse, which is where he was earlier. But you know, we'll see.
Yeah. That's a great reminder for all of us, I think. And that pride can get in the way, but God has a plan, and that ultimately our best days, if we're believers in Christ and we're living under his rule, our best days are really truly ahead of us.
Because and we talked about this not a ton in the sermon, but because it was largely about Nebuchadnezzar, but as we think going forward, you know, even the sermon you will give in a few weeks, or Pete, I can't remember. Are you doing the Daniel one, the Lion's Den one?
Yeah, I've got that one.
Okay. So, I mean, I haven't thought it all through, but, you know, the beauty of Daniel's faith, you know, for him to be able to speak so, you know, sort of like truth in love. Let's call it truth in love. Right. He doesn't soften this very awful dream like you're going to lose your mind.
Right.
But he says, my advice to you is change your ways, and maybe I can't remember the exact words. Maybe this will work out okay for you. But it's truth and love.
Yes.
And so there's something there for us too.
Yeah.
As we think about how to have faith in a faithless world, how can we, it's easy to write people off. You and me, to write off people who we feel, we've shared the gospel with them many times, or others have, and they're just so intractable in their thinking or whatever, or in their behavior. And Daniel demonstrates a real wisdom and maturity, and kind of doesn't give up on his, I don't know if he's his friend, but on this king. And it's a beautiful thing.
That is. Well, as we think through this, I think for ourselves, whether you're processing this in your small group or just individually, I think a great question coming out of this sermon is, when has pride gotten in the way of your relationship with God?
Yeah.
That's a sobering one to ask, but I think it's an appropriate one for us to ask.
Right.
And when was the last time that happened, or when was a time in your life that happened? And have you had moments where you've had to kind of be humble and admit that before God and return to him? And what has that experience been like for you? Because ultimately that's the experience here of Nebuchadnezzar. And I think that's what he's calling each of us to do, even through this story, is to return to God in humility. Yeah. So that's our hope. That's our prayer for all of us, that we would be living those kind of lives. So thanks for following along with us again today. And we'll see you right back here next week on Between Two Sermons.